Good evening, everyone. I'm Srđa Pavlović, a research associate with the Wirth Institute for Austrian and Central European Studies at the University of Alberta. This evening's presentation is not going to be a traditional research paper type of presentation. It will be more of an essay written some time ago dealing with the questions of history, memory, and the politics of naming in the Balkans. Many would argue that there is a conflict and a subtle but nonetheless everlasting struggle between spaces and identities, between our immediate environment and us. This conflict spells out people's desire to own, and it also highlights contested nature of our claims to the highest spot in a hierarchy of belonging, which could be summarized by the proclamation, "We were here first." It is all about the orchard and an apple tree, and the obligatory presence of a serpent. It is all about the field from the Old Testament where Cain's psalm rules. It could also be argued that such conflict is a figment of imagination, and that things are the other way around. That relationship between identities and spaces, which I'm decoding here as contentious, as confrontational, is actually, in essence, a harmonious relationship, an interconnected one. And because of this interconnectedness, each step we take, each time we move, space demands that we conceptualize ourselves in relation to it. We cannot exist without locating ourselves and without simultaneously subjectifying and positioning ourselves. So in spite of the fact that we have first to learn the rules of space or territory and adjust to them, before we act on our impulse to change it and appropriate it, some might even say that it is people who are defining space by naming it. Thus it is us who have the upper hand. Vanity and the will to possess seem to be main features of human history. Indeed, a name is a description with historical connotations, personal meanings, and cultural resonance drawn from our conscious environment, but reflective of our subconscious selves. Every space, every place, has its own story of demons, story of spirits, tribal fires, ancestors, which through configuration we mold into history, as Hyde and White taught us. While naming space, we are appropriating such a story and we are locating ourselves within history, thus claiming the ownership of all three: space, story, and history. In naming, whether everyday usage or idiosyncratic messaging, we express both the power of the past and the importance of our present activity. In naming, we are free to choose to be the same as others in our world or to be different. The question is, how are we to use such a choice? Through what languages should be expressed? So should our choice, for example, be an expression of our memories about the past and our sense of belonging to the collective? Or should our approach to space, place, or territory, or landscape, and our relationship with it always remain fresh, new, an experience of the first kiss, unique, detached from the past? Should we resort to a native tongue? Or should we use Latin to tell the story and name the space Insula Nova Undecesima Die Junius Nubibus Revelata? Following Jacques Lacan's observation that no language can speak the truth about truth, it would be naive of us to believe that naming space and appropriating it by imposing on it memories of our ancestors could endow us with anything but a temporary and unstable sense of ownership. If anything, history teaches us that naming space does not always guarantee eternal existence of people and memories of them, let alone provide safe harbors for our fragile identities. Different names given in different times to spaces, cities, towns in Central Europe and the Balkans reminds us of how short-lasting were efforts in appropriating space through naming it according to one's tribal, ethnic, national, or religious criteria. So, Koloshvar used to be Klausenberg and is now called Cluj-Napoca. The town once known as Hermannstadt is now softly referred to by Romanians as Sibiu. Sighișoara, which was once Schlasberg and therefore before that Castrum 6, Fort 6, is now known as Hungarian Székesfehérvár. Those changes of names confirm the existence of a multitude of cognitive maps that function as a palimpsest. But it is also something that points out possibility of multiple and often competing identities. Moreover, it portrays the struggle of national languages against each other, the struggle over territory, and the right or desire to be heard and to be remembered. The struggle over territory is often, if not always, an important segment of a given nationalism, and the recent history of the South Slavs could serve as a good example of that. In the late 19th century, the Serb and Croat national ideologies rested upon dreams of territorial expansion, which were rationalized by the emotionally charged political rhetoric about notions such as cradle of civilization or the land of ancestors, that in turn should be reclaimed once and for all. Those two national ideologies came into conflict over the question of the territories that are to be liberated from foreign rule. As the South Slavic politicians of the time used to say, the dominant discourse of the national elites of the period, however, was not liberation, but appropriation of space and its incorporation into either Greater Serbia or Greater Croatia. With this in mind, it would be prudent to revise the canonical view of the so-called period of national liberation of the South Slavs and examine a bit more historical developments in the region within the framework of expansionist policies of regional elites. Throughout the history of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia post-1918, as well as that of its socialist successor state, Yugoslavia, renaming and appropriating space seem to have been one of the main features of the region's history. This is not to say that such practice was not common in earlier periods or in other places around the globe. It has been. But back to the Balkans, during the Ottoman rule in the region, medieval town of Vartsarevo became Vartsarvakov, only to be renamed Mrkonjić Grad in 1924, glorifying the old king. The town of Duvno went back and forth in time, being renamed Tomislavgrad in 1925, and some decades later earning again the right to its old name. The post-1945 capital of Montenegro also witnessed several attempts on naming and renaming. What was once Roman Doclea became Podgorica, and then Titovgrad or Titograd, and again Podgorica. From 1945 to 1992, the northern Montenegrin town of Berane was called Ivangrad in celebration of the ideological radicalism of the Montenegrin communist leader Ivan Milutinovic. The only names that survive are those ancient names of rivers. Calm waters adorning western Bosnian landscape are still called River Una. Being among a few relatively stable features of space we inhabit and name, rivers were often used as either a reminder of an old boundary between us and them, or as a modern-day no man's land, separating former combatants and groups that could not live together any longer due to irreconcilable differences. At the time of heightened nationalistic instincts, and in spite of the much-used rhetoric of inclusion, multiculturalism, and reconciliation, as it is still the case throughout the former Yugoslavia, rivers, once again, function as dividers along the lines of ethnic and national belonging and/or religious affiliation. So for hundreds of years, River Drina was the dividing line between Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, as well as between different ethnic and national groups in the region. In the minds of many Serbian nationalists, Drina's banks still mark the western boundary of their beloved ancestral land. Not long ago, River Neretva was enforced as a bloody demarcation line between two communities in the city of Mostar. Aside from cutting off lines of communication and disabling physical contact between people living on the opposing riverbanks, the recent destruction of a beautiful medieval arc over Neretva was also a symbolic cutting off of interethnic and interreligious ties that for centuries bounded together citizens of Mostar. Similarly, former UN checkpoints on the banks of a small stream of water winding through the city of Kosovska Mitrovica were the potent symbol of the current ethnic and national divisions in the Kosovo region. Nationalistic obsession with carving out and reinforcing such division lines might be the reason why many of them intensely hate bridges and try to destroy them whenever they can. Frightened by the power of silence of space, we are trying to fill it up with our own names, our own voices, our own groans, and anchor our bodies within it, as if each of us is subconsciously trying to define our own thoughts and ideas about ourselves. So, like ants, we are rushing to reach the top of a shaky pyramid of grass and dirt with the hope that our effort in thickening its walls would provide security and stability for our uncertain identities. So while struggling to define ourselves by the shape, size, height, and thickness of the walls that surround us, we are feeding a Janus-faced beast called nation of commonality, either tribal, ethnic, national. But at least for a short period of time, we become space, and space becomes us. But all we are doing is endlessly naming and renaming ourselves and anchoring our notion of belonging and home deep inside an imaginary landscape, because we are reluctant to admit that our daily lives revolve around issues of heterogeneity and difference. Naming space, molding it, and filling its void with signifiers of ethnic, religious, and national are manifestations of human power relations. From the time first drawings adorned the walls of Lascaux to the Space Needle in Seattle, those who had power constructed and reconstructed spaces and filled them with meanings, thus confirming their dual function as tools of self-identification and as markers of a balance of power in a given society. It could also be said that in a rather unusual way, and through a set of mnemonic devices, the destruction of space or place carries same dual function. This seemingly reverse logic is particularly relevant with regards to the recent events in the former Yugoslavia. Viewed through short-sighted spectacles of expansionist nationalism, a destruction of space paired with dramatic and violent demographic changes and its subsequent renaming seemed as preconditions for, quote, a new beginning, and marked the initial stages in the process of recomposing old or constructing new signifiers of identity for both people and space. The notion of the earlier mentioned ancestral land that has to be repossessed from the unwanted other drives the nationalistic-minded obsession with renaming and recomposing spaces and identities, and uses destruction and violence as means for achieving what is thought to be ethnically pure Garden of Eden. So the post-Dayton division of Bosnia and Herzegovina formalized the existence of the entity of the Republic of Srpska, which led to 13 towns and cities being instantly renamed, or having the ethnic prefix Srpsko, meaning Serbian, added to their names. So the sections of Sarajevo controlled by the Serbs became Srpsko Sarajevo, Serbian Sarajevo, while the new names of towns such as Srpski Drvar, Srpski Sanski Most, Srpski Mostar, Srpsko Goražde, and Srpski Ključ marked the outer edges of the newly created ethnic paradise. The old town of Foča is now called Srbinje, and like other renamed towns, its new name carries a strong Serbian ethnic mark. The town formerly known as Bosanski Novi seems like a different story of renaming. It recently acquired a new set of clothes through its new name, Novi Grad, new town. It is interesting to know that unlike Srbinje, formerly Foča, the new name for Bosanski Novi carries no obvious ethnic symbols. It does project, however, a strong message about the aforementioned new beginning. In the minds of nationalists, a new arrangement of a space constructed or reconstructed in such a way carries a message that everything is indeed in its rightful place, just as it should have been from the time immemorial. What is created is a new landscape with lights of tribal fires bleeding out of it, and a place where restless air is invoking long-gone ancestors, either real or imagined. In spite of such invocations, what we see is indeed a new landscape, because what once was could never be duplicated. It is a new landscape and a new space, because it is the product of our dreams. We dream of repairing our longing for home by recreating collage of past lives in a space we remember as once being inhabited by those lives, and now vacant. Such recreation usually has no bearings onto our past lives, but is constructed out of hopes, imaginary relationships with space and its silence, and possesses many elements of fantasy, much like Callimachus, the famous 3rd century BC cataloger of the ancient Alexandrian library and the author of Pinakes. We are also nostalgic, since nostalgia is a longing for an ideal presence that is no longer and might have never been. Such sentiments are not only expressions of loss, but also of displacement. Moreover, it is a love affair with one's memory of past lives and fantasy that is frozen in time. Within the growing body of literature that concerns itself with issues of construction and of reconstruction of spaces and identities in the Western world, it is possible to distinguish between the two main thematic clusters. The first one is the phenomenon of positive promotion of space and location, building of an image, reconfiguration of cities, and placing emphasis on urban tourism where were seen as tools in the process of regenerating of urban spaces, and in contrast to earlier negative imagery of urban spaces characterized by decay, favelas, and industrial quote-unquote graveyards. The second thematic flow is somewhat cynical in its strong emphasis on fake elements in this process of the reconstruction of space, where the home shelters daydreaming, and we are told, creates fake identities and lifeless life. Advocates of this analytical approach point out that the power of capitalism and its ever-growing appetite to exercise social control remains hidden behind the glitzy and multicolor facade of entertainment and fantasy, Las Vegas, for example. In the Balkans, in general, and throughout the former Yugoslavia in particular, we are also witnessing a process of reconstructing of spaces and identities that is very similar in character and aim with the reconstruction efforts in the Western world. This similarity, however, is somewhat hidden behind layers of colors thought unique for a local Balkan framework. Upon a closer examination, it turns out that what we are seeing in the former Yugoslavia, or its successor states, is an awkwardly applied collage of different elements, different signifiers, architectural and cultural, that constitute Western model for revitalizing spaces, urban spaces in particular, and reshaping identities as a consequence of it. Even though it highly resembles Western models, such architectural and cultural simulacrum is indeed new to the former Yugoslavia in terms of content and message, which were intended for both foreign and domestic consumption. Painting it over with local colors might indicate sudden awakening of the local population to the realities of life in a multi-ethnic and multicultural space, while the retention of a few signifiers of past lives and practices, religious or cultural, highlights the notion of being well grounded within a given tradition. So striking such a balance after a bloody conflict in the region seems to enjoy a certain level of acceptance in the West. Even though the daily lives of people throughout the former Yugoslavia might actually function according to a very different codes, the representational character of quote-unquote changes is viewed in the West as a clear indicator of progress. People wearing Armani suits, Ray-Ban glasses, and traditional Muslim dresses intermingle in the lobbies of new office buildings designed according to Western standards. For many Westerners, this means that life in the Balkans is getting better, and dreams of coexistence seem achievable after all. What is being sidelined, however, is the fact that dreams seldom come true. The message intended for the domestic consumption is one of hope and progress. There is, however, a slight problem with such a message. The domestic effort in recreating space and reassigning its meaning is a promise based on a contradiction, because it advocates change while claiming continuity. It is a promise of a new beginning, or, as Hannah Arendt put it, quote, a unique human way of ordering the future. It is also a promise of complete reliance on tradition, since we always have to remain connected to our past, and yet must pull us further away from it as possible. To remain in touch with our past presupposes constant imaginative effort and a love of memory. Because such love of memory in the former Yugoslavia mutated into obsession that fed on blood of unwanted others, it seemed most appropriate to recreate spaces marked with blood and scattered bones by Hollywoodizing them, leveling all graves and then erecting over them clean architectural forms which could hide the disturbing content of an ongoing inner struggle with our memories of recent events. New structures are meant to hide pain and encourage people to try and forget past sufferings. Such hasty external beautification of pain, suffering, and displacement, which still remains largely unpronounceable, disturbs the basic premise of our relationship to space. It depersonalizes it. And our relationship to space or to place is inherently personal. It is all about persistent appropriation coupled with our unwillingness to admit or our inability to grasp human ephemerality and the fact that we are only the percentage of the reckoning. This relationship consists of two major building blocks that, at the start of a journey, differ somewhat from one another. The difference could be defined as that between my beloved landscape and the landscape of my beloved. The former signifies notion of space in terms of geography, territory, which is imagined or recognized as ours alone and has symbolic and strategic value. This is a tale about a tree, its roots and its branches, and a story about Anteus, a conservative myth about homeland which keeps us immobile. It is also a dream of the colors of our paradise, imagining a beautiful and exquisite female who shall, at the end of the day, fall prey to one of the warring parties. The latter is the projection of the idea or ideal of home, of belonging, and softness of women's skin, wrapped in a warm blanket of the memory of good old days. In other words, it is a portrait of an imaginary geography of the soul and an effort to change the nature of time and materialize it so that we could revisit past much in the same manner we are able to walk through the old neighborhood once again. In the end, the differences evaporate and the two notions merge. We find ourselves stranded an ocean away from our Ithaca, away from our beloved island on which our beloved shall forever remain unreachable. Thus, the island becomes a symbol and a substitute for both longing for space and for the intimacy of social poetics of a collective. Forever out of reach, the island is my beloved landscape and the landscape of my beloved. Our relationship with it is a romance and an often tragic love story with all the twists and turns of a Hollywood blockbuster. Love, affection, sensuality, betrayal, anger, revenge, regrets, blood and tears. It is a tale of picking up scattered remnants of our past selves and putting back together the puzzle of identity in a slightly different way. It is simultaneously an archaeology of belonging and the recomposition of being, the traces of our past lives that are hastily sewn together in order to fit as best as they could within the new imagined homeland. Thank you.